During that summer, many other girls in the school died too. Mr. Brocklehurst sold the school, and it became a happier place. I stayed at school until I was 18, and then I had to find a job. I wanted to become a teacher. I wrote a letter to a newspaper. I said I was a young teacher who wanted a job working in a family. Then I waited for an answer. At last, an answer came. It was from a lady, Mrs. Fairfax. Mrs. Fairfax, who lived at a place called Thornfield Hall. She needed a teacher for a little girl, so I packed my clothes in a small bag and travelled to Thornfield Hall. I felt very excited when I arrived at Thornfield Hall. The house was large, but it seemed very quiet. Mrs. Fairfax met me at the door. She was an old lady with a kind face. "Sit down, Miss Eyre," she said. "You look tired after your journey. Later you will meet Adele." "Is Adele my student?" I asked. "Yes, she is. She's French. Mr. Rochester wants you to teach her English." "Who's Mr. Rochester?" I asked. Mrs. Fairfax looked surprised. "Didn't you know? Thornfield Hall belongs to Mr. Rochester," she answered. "I only work for him." "Is Mr. Rochester here now?" I asked. "No, he's away. He doesn't come very often to Thornfield. I don't know when he will return." Later, I met Adele. She was a pretty little girl. I spoke to her in French and began to teach her English. She enjoyed her lessons, and I enjoyed teaching her. I liked Adele, and I liked Mrs. Fairfax too. It was quiet at Thornfield Hall, and sometimes I felt a little bored, but everybody was kind to me there. One afternoon, I walked to the village to post a letter. It was winter, and there was ice on the road. As I was walking back to Thornfield Hall, I heard noise behind me. It was a horse. A man was riding towards Thornfield Hall. I stood on one side, and the horse went past. The man didn't see me. He was a stranger with dark hair. Suddenly, with a loud noise, the stranger's horse fell down on the ice. The man was lying on the ground, trying to get up. I ran forward to help. "Are you hurt, sir?" I asked him. The stranger looked surprised to see me. "A little," he answered. "Could you help me catch my horse?" "That's right." "Now, could you bring the horse here, please?" "Thank you." The stranger tried to stand up, but his leg was hurting too. He looked at me again. "Could you help me to get up on its back again?" "Good. Thank you, miss." I watched him as he rode away. Who is he? I asked myself. He's not handsome, but he has an interesting face. I'd like to know him. When I got back to Thornfield, everybody was very excited. Mrs. Fairfax was very busy. "What's happening?" I asked her. "Oh, Miss Eyre, it's Mr. Rochester," she said. "He has suddenly come back, but he will probably go away again soon. Now, Miss Eyre, you must go and put on your best dress. Mr. Rochester wants to meet you and Adele after dinner." Later that evening, I took Adele to Mr. Rochester's room. I felt rather afraid of meeting Mr. Rochester. I went quietly into the room and saw a man there. I knew him. It was the man on the horse. So the interesting stranger was Mr. Rochester? Mr. Rochester didn't go away again. He was busy every day, but sometimes in the evenings he talked to me. He was usually serious, and he didn't smile or laugh very often, but he was interesting, and I wasn't afraid of him. I began to enjoy myself more at Thornfield Hall. One night I woke up suddenly. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. I thought I heard a sound. Everything was very quiet. I listened carefully, and the sound came back again. Someone was walking about outside my room. "Who's there?" I called. Nobody answered. I felt cold and frightened. The house was silent. I tried to sleep again. Then I heard a laugh. It was a terrible, cruel laugh. I listened. Someone was walking away, going up the stairs to the attic. What was happening? I decided to go and find Mrs. Fairfax. I put on some clothes and I left my room. The house was quiet now, but suddenly I could smell smoke. Something was burning. I ran to find out. The smoke was coming from Mr. Rochester's room. I ran into the room and looked around. Mr. Rochester was asleep in his bed, and the bed was on fire. What can I do? I thought quickly. I looked around the room. Luckily, there was some water in one corner. As quickly as I could, I took the water and threw it all over the bed. Mr. Rochester woke up. "What's happening?" he shouted. "Jane, is it you? What are you doing?" "Mr. Rochester," I said, "your bed is on fire. You must get up at once." He jumped out of bed. There was water everywhere, and the fire was still smoking. "Jane, you've saved me from the fire. How did you know about this? Why did you wake me up?" Mr. Rochester asked. I told him about the noise outside my door and the terrible laugh. Mr. Rochester looked serious and angry. "I must go upstairs to the attic. Stay here and wait for me, please. Don't wake Mrs. Fairfax." He left the room and I waited for him. At last, he came back. He was still looking very serious. "You can go back to bed now, Jane. Everything is all right now." "Who lives in the attic?" I asked Mrs. Fairfax the next day. "Only Grace Poole," she answered. "She's one of the servants. She's a strange woman." I remembered Grace Poole. She was a strange, silent woman who didn't often speak to the other servants. So perhaps it was Grace Poole who walked around the house late at night and laughed strangely outside the doors. That evening, when Adele finished her lessons, I went downstairs. Mrs. Fairfax met me. "Mr. Rochester left the house early this morning," she said. "He's going to stay with his friends. I think he'll stay with them for some weeks. I don't know when he will come back." For several weeks, the house was very quiet again. Mr. Rochester stayed with his friends, and I continued my lessons with Adele. I didn't hear the strange and terrible laugh at night again. One day, Mrs. Fairfax showed me a letter from Mr. Rochester. "He's coming back," she said, "and he's bringing a lot of visitors with him. I'm going to be very busy getting everything ready. Miss Blanche Ingram is coming too. She's very beautiful." Mr. Rochester and his friends arrived. The visitors were all rich, important people. Miss Blanche Ingram was among them. She was very beautiful, but also very proud. Some of the visitors were nice to me, but others didn't notice me. I was too poor and unimportant. Miss Ingram never spoke to me. She was not interested in me, but she seemed to be interested in Mr. Rochester. She always seemed to enjoy her conversations with him. They often went out riding together. "I think Mr. Rochester will marry Miss Ingram," said Mrs. Fairfax. But was Mr. Rochester interested in Blanche Ingram? He seemed to like her, but he didn't look very happy when they were together. One evening, a new visitor came to Thornfield Hall. He was a quite young man with dark hair called Mr. Mason. He came to see Mr. Rochester on business. Mr. Mason told us that he and Mr. Rochester were old friends. But Mr. Rochester wasn't very pleased to see Mr. Mason. When Mr. Rochester heard this name, Mr. Mason from the West Indies, he was surprised and his face turned white. That night, Mr. Rochester and Mr. Mason talked for a long time. At last, very late at night, they went to bed. Soon, everyone in the house was asleep. Suddenly, I woke up. I heard a terrible scream from somewhere over my head. Then everything was very quiet again. I listened carefully, and then I heard a lot of noise from above my head. There seemed to be fighting in the room above. Then there was another scream. "Help! Help!" Someone shouted. There was more fighting. Then a voice called out, "Rochester, come quickly! Help me!" A door opened and I heard someone running up the stairs to the attic. I quickly put on some clothes and opened my door. Everybody in the house was awake now. The visitors were all standing outside the doors. "What's happening? Is there a fire? What was that noise?" they asked. Mr. Rochester came down from the attic. "Please don't worry. Everything is all right," he told his friends. "But what's happening?" someone asked. "One of the servants had a bad dream and started to scream," Mr. Rochester said. "But everything is all right now. Please go back to your beds." Slowly, all Mr. Rochester's visitors returned to the rooms. I too went back to my room, but I didn't go back to bed. I sat and looked out the window. The house was very quiet now. There were no sounds from the attic. Then someone knocked on my door. I opened it. Mr. Rochester stood outside. "Jane, come with me, please. But come quietly. Follow me," he told me. I followed Mr. Rochester up to the attic. He unlocked the door of a room and we went inside. "Wait here," Mr. Rochester told me. I stood next to the door. There was another door on the opposite side of the room. From behind this door, I could hear a terrible sound. It was like an angry animal. Mr. Rochester left me and went through this door. Once again, I heard that terrible, cruel laugh. Was Grace Poole behind the door? Mr. Rochester spoke to someone inside the room and then came out and locked the door again. "Come here, Jane," he told me quietly. I came further into the room. There was a large bed in the room. Mr. Mason was laying on the bed. His face was white. His eyes were closed. There was a lot of blood on his shirt. He didn't move. "Is he dead?" I asked. "No," answered Mr. Rochester. "He isn't badly hurt, but I must go and bring the doctor for him. Will you stay with him until I get back?" The man on the bed moved and tried to speak. Mr. Rochester turned to him. "Don't try to talk, Mason. Jane, do not speak to him, please. There must be no conversation between you." Mr. Rochester hurried out of the room. I waited for him with the silent man on the bed. I was frightened. I knew that Grace Poole was in the next room. For a long time I waited for Mr. Rochester to return. When will he come back? I asked myself. At last, morning came, and Mr. Rochester returned with the doctor. While the doctor was looking after Mr. Mason, Mr. Rochester spoke to me. "Thank you for all your help, Jane. Mason is going to leave Thornfield Hall now. The doctor will take him away," he told me. We helped Mr. Mason down the stairs and out of the house. It was still early, and other people in the house were still asleep. "Take care of poor Mason," said Mr. Rochester to the doctor. "Soon he will be able to go back home to the West Indies." Before he left, Mr. Mason said something very strange. "Look after her, Rochester," he said. "Promise to look after her." Mr. Rochester looked sad. "I promise. I'll always look after her." I started to go back to the house. "Don't go, Jane," said Mr. Rochester. "Come into the garden. Talk to me." We went into the garden. "What a night," he said. "Were you frightened, Jane?" "Yes, I was frightened up there in the next room. There was someone. That terrible laugh. Mr. Rochester, will Grace Poole go away now?" "No. But don't you worry about Grace Poole. Try to forget about her. She isn't dangerous. It's Mason I'm worrying about," he said. I was surprised to hear this. "Mr. Mason? But he's frightened. He can't hurt you." Mr. Rochester looked sad. "I know Mason doesn't want to hurt me, but he could say something that will hurt me. I shall be happier when he goes back to the West Indies." Later that day, I got a surprising letter. Mrs. Reed, my aunt, was dying, and she wanted to see me. It was a long journey to her home. When I got there, I heard that my cousin Joan was dead. Mrs. Reed was very ill. At first, she didn't want to speak to me. Then, one day, when I was sitting by her bed, she showed me a letter. It was from my uncle, my father's brother, who lived in Madeira. This was the letter. "Dear Mrs. Reed, please help me. I want to find my brother's daughter, Jane Eyre. I'm a rich man and I have no children. I want Jane Eyre to come and live with me. Yours sincerely, Jane Eyre." I read the letter and looked at the date on it. "But, Mrs. Reed, this is an old letter. You got it 3 years ago." "I know," she said, "but I never liked you, Jane Eyre. After I read the letter I wrote to your uncle, I told him you were dead. I told him you died at Lowood School. Now, go away. Leave me." Soon afterwards, Mrs. Reed died, and I returned to Thornfield Hall. It was summer, and the fields around Thornfield Hall were very quiet and beautiful. For me, it was the most beautiful place in the world. It was my home now. "Adele, will you be pleased to see me?" I thought, but what about Mr. Rochester? He's the person I most want to see. But does he want to see me? Perhaps by now he's already married to Blanche Ingram. If they aren't already married, they will be married very soon. I felt sad when I thought about Mr. Rochester and Blanche Ingram. so I must soon leave this beautiful place, I thought. Can't stay here when Mr. Rochester is married. I'll never see Thornfield Hall again, and worse than that, I'll never see Mr. Rochester again. As I came near the house, I met Mr. Rochester. When I saw that he looked pleased to see me, I felt happier. Adele and Mrs. Fairfax were happy to see me too. "The visitors have all left now," said Mrs. Fairfax. "It's very quiet here. It's good to see you again." Yes, this is my home, I thought. I've always been happy here. How can I leave it now? I started to work, teaching Adele again. Everything was the same as before. Mr. Rochester still said nothing about getting married to Blanche Ingram. Then one evening he saw me in the garden. "Come, talk to me, Jane," he said. I went towards him. Now, I thought, he's going to tell me that he's going to get married. "Are you happy here, Jane?" he asked. "Yes, I'm very happy," I answered. "And you like Adele and Mrs. Fairfax?" "Very much," I said. "You'll be sad to leave them," he said. I looked away. Now he's going to tell me that I must leave because he's going to be married, I thought. I looked at him. "Yes," I answered. "I'll be very sad to leave." "But you must leave, you know," Mr. Rochester said. "Must I? Must I leave soon?" "Yes, soon." "Then you're going to get married?" "Yes, I am going to get married. Adele must go to school, and you must get a new job. I'll find you one, far from here." "Far from here?" I asked. "But then I'll never see Thornfield Hall again, and I'll never see you again, Mr. Rochester." "Oh, when you're far from here, you'll soon forget me," he said. "No," I thought. "You'll forget me, perhaps, but I'll never forget you." "Never," I answered him at last, and I started to cry. I couldn't speak. He watched me carefully. Then at last he spoke again. "Perhaps you don't need to go. Perhaps you can stay here when I'm married." Did Mr. Rochester think that I had no feelings? Did he not understand how I felt? Were my feelings so unimportant? I now felt angry. "No," I told him. "I could never stay. I'll not stay. Miss Ingram will be your wife. I know that I'm not rich and beautiful like Miss Ingram. I'm poor and unimportant. But I can still feel sadness. And if you marry Miss Ingram, I must leave now." Mr. Rochester looked at me, and then he smiled. "I don't want you to go, Jane, and I'm not going to marry Miss Ingram. Don't get excited. I want you to stay here. It's you I want to marry." I couldn't believe him. Now you're laughing at me?" I said. "No, I'm not," he answered. "I want to marry you, Jane. Will you marry me?" He looked at me so seriously that at last I did believe him. Mr. Rochester wanted to marry me. He wanted me to be his wife. Yes, I'll marry you," I answered. "I'll make you happy, Jane. No one will stop us," he continued with a strange, half-sad look. I couldn't understand that look, but I was too happy to be worried about it. It grew dark, the wind began to blow, and it started to rain, so we walked together back to the house.